2010, and then it got handed over to the Hazardous Waste Bureau in 2010.
Is this being filmed? Are you filming this? Is that what's going on?
We're now 4 years past that time. There is no interim plan. There's been promises we're going to have an interim plan and that kind of thing. It doesn't exist. It's not moving forward in any meaningful way. There's been shortages of funds for equipment. We don't even know what the funding looks like at this point in time. I had to file a Freedom of Information Act to get the last contract between Shaw and the Air Force, and that showed a $23 million commitment, and they withheld over 700 pages of that contract. So there really hasn't been a lot of transparency in terms of what we've seen. Part of the problem out there has been lack of effective groundwater monitoring. In 2012, the City Water Utility Authority passed 2 resolutions. One of them was Resolution 1214, and that was Ray Garduno sponsored that. I wrote that resolution up at his request, and it asked for monitoring wells to be placed as near as possible to the municipal wells. That hasn't been done, and there's no reason for that not to have been done. Those city wells, to say that that's safe drinking water, I don't know how that can be realistically concluded when you have 800-foot long screens pumping at over 2,000 gallons a minute with dilution of those samples. A monitoring well screen is 10 to 15 feet long and takes very discrete samples, and there's a whole methodology for getting those samples, and that has not been put into place. The recent models that have come out making projections of 30 to 40 years are lacking the type of data that you need to have in order to even choose what model you want to use, let alone put into the model itself. The entire area between what is thought to be the location of the leading edge of the plume, which is still unknown, that's not known, but where they think it might be, and where the municipal wells are, could be around the area of 4,000 feet. That area has not been really adequately investigated for its hydraulic conductivity and a lot of other factors. There are no monitoring wells in that area to really know what's going on there. And one thing that's been suggested by several people, technical people, is that there could be monitoring wells set right down what they think the center of that plume of contamination is, all the way down to the municipal wells, to find out exactly how far that's gone, how fast it's moving, this kind of thing. So we still don't know the full longitudinal width of it. We don't know the depth of it. We don't know how fast it's moving. We do know that it's extremely toxic and you don't want it in the water. And it's been mentioned that some people think, well, there's a hysterical reaction going on in the public. Well, I can only say that when this stuff hits the municipal wells, if it does, if nothing's done, you're gonna see some real hysteria. And it's gonna go to every politician who is in charge, who was in charge, and it's not gonna be pretty. It's gonna affect the economy of this town in ways that are not even foreseen at present. So that's probably enough of a description of the problem, and I'm sure you folks are well aware of some of those aspects. So I won't belabor that, but we've summarized a few of those points. As far as the task force goes, we've outlined what we think that should look like here. And the first thing we want is that, and it starts down at the bottom, is we want them to be independent of the existing contractors and regulators. We feel that it should have about 10 members, and we'd like to see a stakeholder representative on that task force, and we'd like to see some nationally recognized experts in various fields of hazardous waste spills, hydrogeology, geology, risk assessment, remediation technology, and health disciplines, those kind of things. We'd like there to be transparency at all times. There currently isn't real transparency in this situation. A lot of records are not really ever seen by the public. We'd like to see a plan to improve the technical approaches coming out of this, and for how the current management could better interact, in other words, between EPA and the New Mexico Environment Department, the Air Force, and the other players. We think that there needs to be kind of an overall look at that, and that's something the task force could pull together. We think it would be useful for the existing players. Right now, you've got NMED saying one thing, Air Force saying, well, we don't want to do that. You've got the Water Utility Authority not knowing which way the ball is going to go, really. In the past, Senator Udall and Senator Bingaman asked for the Water Utility Authority to be included in this situation. And that's happened to an extent, but certainly they're not in the driver's seat, and they're uncertain as to what their actual authority in all of this is. So we think the task force could kind of accomplish a little bit more cohesiveness and a better technological approach than what we've seen to date. So we've outlined these things here. We'd like to see the task force recommend what studies need to be accomplished, what kind of technology could be put into place on an emergency basis to deal with this problem, to make sure it really doesn't hit the municipal wells. And our concern here on a basic level is that we think the Air Force may be planning to not do anything really other than put up a show that you know, they're doing some soil vapor evaporation, and they're going to do some pump and treat, but they don't want to really get in and do the job that needs to be done in order to characterize this spill. And that's evident in their March 2011 report to Congress that they made, where they said they were going to basically leave the dissolved ethylene dibromide plume to natural processes. And I sent you a copy of that, so I know you've seen it. And leaving this to natural processes is not the way to go, because it EDB hardly biodegrades at all. We want to see something more action-oriented and immediate with respect to this. The task force should recommend that the necessary data for understanding the full size, extent, and velocity of the contamination should be displayed. And we want to see that on realistic maps. Currently what we're being given is a map that'll show the outline of the plume, okay? And that map is drawn to 50 parts per trillion, which is the maximum contamination limit. The detection limit is 10 parts per trillion. So if you're looking at the actual detection, that could be out here somewhere. Yet we're being handed a map, a plume map, that shows this size rather than what may be all the way out here. So this is a real distortion that's constantly put in front of the public at these public meetings, and I've brought it to their attention numerous times, and it's not ever corrected. When they have monitoring wells that are, say, out here, outside this 50 parts per trillion, they list everything as showing a level of 29 parts per trillion, but then they put a U value for it, which means undetected. Well, that's just nonsense. You know, what is the actual detection? And the Water Utility Authority has asked for that too. So there's a lot of technical problems and a lot of management problems, and we'd really like to see this task force come together, take a good hard look at it, and see what they come up with as a way to move this process forward in some kind of meaningful way. We're not interested in, you know, criticizing the existing regulatory powers through this particularly. We're just interested in seeing some people that have got some knowledge and experience, and there's not too many people that have dealt with a spill, certainly of this size. There's nobody in the country, because this is the largest in the country. So we'd like to see some people, though, that have dealt with this. There are people in California that have dealt with ethylene dibromide plumes, South Carolina, I think Minnesota had some, and we'd like to see some people who have looked at this kind of thing have a feel for how a large project like this should proceed. Right now, the Environment Department just simply doesn't have the capacity to deal with this, and yet they're the driver in this situation. They really need help here. Whether they want to admit it or not, they need help. You've got a new secretary who is an attorney. I'm an attorney, and God knows I don't know enough about environmental contamination and that kind of thing. And he doesn't either. And the person, they put this under the health division with a person who has no experience with hazardous waste management law. He's a civil engineer, nice guy, but he's really out of his league. Okay? They're the driver, and they're not taking the steps that they should to really put this thing in motion. You know, for the largest spill in history, there hasn't been a single dollar of sanctions when orders aren't followed. I mean, it's just not moving as it should be. And one of the committee members, the chair of the Public Affairs and Public and Consumer Affairs in the House, Representative Alcon, made the comment that he's been watching this since 2008, and he said he's heard the same thing over and over again, which is, we're going to take care of it. And he said he just hasn't seen the movement on the thing. And Nobody knows exactly when this mess is going to arrive. The 30-year estimate, that was at the maximum contaminant limit. But what about the trace amounts that start arriving much earlier? And that was only a draft model and it was based on inadequate data. But just assuming that that's the case, what about the trace amounts that may be arriving earlier? How do we know when those are going to be there? Why isn't there the monitoring wells out there as sentry wells to give us early warning? Anyhow, my voice is running out. I'm sure other people want to say some things, so that's kind of where we're coming from in a broad sort of way.
As Dave had mentioned, I can tell you how it got to this point and why it got to this point and why it shouldn't have gotten to this point. But the memorial really, I think, very succinctly gives us a path forward. It's not the only path forward, but I think it's a viable path forward that has been reviewed by many people. Many people on the outside are recognize the problems with the progress or lack therein in this particular situation. And that's how we kind of arrived to this point today. And the fact that we have a memorial that's passed, I think, with very constructive and distinct points that need to be recognized. And I've reviewed it and reviewed it and reviewed it. And I don't think I would change anything in that memorial in terms of a path forward. And so I think that congressionally, as you well know, far better than I, you have external oversight committees, external advisory boards to see executive agencies, right? And we have a situation here where we have a very complex, a very large and a very serious spill, and we have a state that is modest by any typical standards. They're more than adequate for dealing with service stations, which has been their typical, which is fine. They have dealt with a lot of those. That's a serious issue. But they haven't dealt with a spill like this and a situation like this. They've always, since the start of this, including the negligence on the part of the Air Force because it could have been prevented, they did not follow procedures in their own operations. I'm not going to criticize the Air Force, but I'm telling you the genesis of where the problem came from. It came from negligence. They fully accept that. We need to go forward. But the Air Force and NMED have undercharacterized this problem since the beginning. And what we've seen is a continuous ramp up in terms of the scale of the problem and in terms of their need for additional help in dealing with this problem. Most recently, we see them reaching out to EPA federal in terms of the modeling. That was done by Kerr Lab in Oklahoma. I talk to Washington regularly with the EPA. I'll be on the phone today at 2. This problem is viewed as the way EPA divides itself, Region 6 out of Dallas. They've given primacy to NMED. That's the structure by which EPA operates. This document and why it's involved here is that this problem is categorized legally under RCRA. And RCRA, just as a point in passing with some of the management problems that 2 of you have heard, is that the current manager at NMED under health doesn't know what RCRA means. He's never used RCRA, he's never applied RCRA, and RCRA is a basic law that's put forth as laws are, but there are tons, literally, on my internet here, of EPA guidance documents to interpret how that law should be implemented. A law is general and it's vague and so on. The interpretation has been well established by EPA and of how you should legally and technically deploy this law and interpret it and apply it. That's why we're here today. That has not been done. They don't understand it. The conceptual site model means nothing to you folks, but it's the tool that's used throughout all environmental problems to integrate and combine all of the data together as you do the characterization and investigation so you can answer all the questions of how you should proceed forward. In other words, the model should be using the mathematical models that we've seen should be using the same conceptual site model. That was not done. EPA had to create their own conceptual site model. CH2 had to create their own conceptual site model. Every modeling effort that's been done has had to create their own. Consequently, each one is different, has a different set of parameters, data, information, etc. that has not been vetted, has not been validated, was criticized by Intera, their own people in a sense, as being inadequate. Why does that happen? Well, it happens because the RCRA guidelines have not been followed. Had the RCRA guidelines been followed, you folks would not be here. We would not be here. It would, in 99% of the cases, have gone properly, smoothly, and so on. Why we're here partly, though, with some justification, is it's a big, big problem. And it overwhelmed the imagination of the Air Force. They were hoping it was limited to a little spill on the surface in the beginning. Then they thought it was limited to the very large vadose zone that we have, the 500 feet. That's why the SVE, some vapor extraction units went in, not for any other reason. They thought and they thought they were done. And that was, the issue there was that they undercharacterized, they underestimated the problem in the first place, and did not put in the groundwater wells, did not spend the money to investigate this properly. Now, admittedly, 500 feet is expensive and it's deep. It's not 10 feet, it's not 20 feet, it's not 100 feet. But they didn't spend the money, and that's why we've been continuously ramping up, is that it was mishandled in the beginning. The reason we have conflicting information, conflicting agencies, and improper management of this system is because they have not used the guidelines of RCRA. They have not applied, and they, meaning mostly NMED. The responsible party, the Air Force, should not be running the cab. That's like the fox telling you that everything's fine in the chicken coop. That never is done. That's completely out of bounds.
Not to interrupt, but is there one paragraph or something you could tell us what guidelines from RCRA would be appropriate, one or two sentences?
Yeah, let me give you I'm glad you asked that, because you can go on here, and there is under EPA laws and regulations. Let me read you the first sentence, and I'll give you the reference to it. EPA develops and issues guidance documents to provide instructions for interpreting and complying with the RCRA regulations. And I will give you that web reference. But there's a whole series of those. I mean a serious number, because it's not a simple issue, because every site is different and unique. We have a general law that applies nationally, and it has to be properly interpreted. The cornerstone of that law is really to pull the data, all the data together into what we call a conceptual site model, which isn't anything to you folks, as I said before, but it's the tool by which they compile and integrate a detailed model with all of the geological data, all the geohydrology data, all of the transport and fate movement data, all the concentration, all of the fluxes, everything that a modeler would need, everything that a technical person would need in order to go forward. That model is in the guidance documents. Can't be required because of a guidance document, but it's so strongly recommended and always followed by every regulatory agency. It was not done in this case. And the more it's not done, and the more they don't understand that process, the more you'll have multiple models with multiple pieces of information, missing data, etc., in terms of being able to model. I mean, how does that come about? Well, they did not create a conceptual site model, which is basically, from your verbiage and understanding, is really a comprehensive plan, and that's what's used in this memorial. It's the terminology we use in the environmental world to say, pull all of the information together that will accurately describe the site and provide consistency. It's vetted, it's checked, it's verified by experts, and all of the missing holes are plugged during what's called the characterization section of RCRA. That's the first step. And they have not done that, and they think they're through with characterization, and they don't even know what a conceptual site model is. So the contractor doesn't know, the Air Force doesn't know, and NMED doesn't know, the people involved, not everybody in NMED. So that's why you're getting a really wide range of variable information, is because they are not following RCRA. In fact, they don't even know what RCRA stands for. So, and the person in charge of this, at his own admission. So what this memorial does, in my opinion, then, to be positive and to go forward, is provide the critically needed oversight, advisory, external input, guidance, whatever you want to call it, that's got to get this project going forward on track, because it has stakeholders involved, it has serious dollars involved, it's a serious issue to Albuquerque, as mentioned by Dave. We need to do that. We need to get it going forward. I think that it's fully appropriate to have a external advisory board or a task force. You can call it a number of different things, but you know what an external advisory board is very well, and you know what their purpose is to give objective input, and we just saw it with NSA and other things, because they do go awry, and they should know better, but it doesn't happen sometimes. And so what's called for here, I mean, we could go through it point by point by point. I don't think that's necessary. I think that getting a group together that's nationally recognized, independent, competent, transparent, and able to give meaningful, constructive, go-forward suggestions to NMED is terribly useful at this point. It's not the only path, but I think it's a path that could be save money, save frustration, get you folks out of the loop. A number of different benefits could come from this. And in the end, what we want to be, you know, EPA's responsibility is to be protective of human health and the environment. They not only have to protect the wells, but all groundwater in New Mexico is ruled as drinking water. They have to clean all that up. And that's not being done. That's not being addressed. There's no plan for that. And so this is a path forward. And I think that you would see that it would have very broad support among, you can give it to any technical regulatory person anywhere, and I think you would see that they would have very little conflict with what's being written here. Yeah, Bill.
If I could, you indicated earlier that you're on the phone with EPA every week.
Every week.
They brought in a scientist and you know, some data and issued their estimate of 30 years, et cetera. In your conversations with EPA, do they indicate that
a scientist did that. A was asked to model by NMED
right.
with the data in hand, which was inadequate because they don't have a conceptual site model. He's a modeler. He just did what he was told. And
but has EPA indicated that, I mean, they, as you indicated, have responsibility for the environment, for protection of water everywhere in the country. Have they ever mentioned to you, you know, why was it RCRA followed? We're going to come in and make sure that it is? I
talked to Washington about that. I can give you the names and contacts. They said, and I've worked with them for 20 years, their structure is to divide the country into regions, as you well know. This problem lies squarely within Region 6. Region 6 is squarely given its primacy to NMED. Until there's a request on your part, well, there's already been a request by NMED, and we've already breached the Region 6. We've gone to the National Laboratory at Ada, Oklahoma, our Kerr Lab, and that's where the modeling was done. But, you know, why is it in conflict with the other models? I'm telling you, because they did not follow RCRA. They do not have a conceptual site model. You cannot fault the modeler or EPA National for the results of what they were asked to do with the data they were given.
Are they aware that there have been several different studies that have different predictions, from 3 to 5 years to 30 years to 40 years? In your conversations with them, are they aware of that too?
I have not had that conversation with them, but they're very competent. I'm telling you that there's no lack of smarts here. And whether they are exactly aware of that, you know, it would only be a guess on my part.
But you could bring that in your conversations, perhaps. Bring that to the
I have brought the issue to Washington, to the policy people in the office there of technology, and until there are reasons, compelling reasons to change their management structure of Region 6, primacy to NMED, they're not going to move on that.
Even with conflicting.
No, that's not enough.
Okay.
That's not. No, I brought up comparative issues that would have been motivational, that they haven't followed RECRA, they don't know what RECRA, and et cetera, et cetera. Those are worse than the modeling issue. That they don't know what a conceptual site model is, they're not following the EPA guidelines, and they keep coming back and saying, this is not a national problem, this is in Region 6. Region 6 has to deal with it. You know,
Despite the fact that it's the Air Force is involved, not a local.
that
service
doesn't change it
doesn't change it.
from a Region 6 problem in Washington's perspective. I'm just telling you what they
Yeah.
said.
Okay.
I'm just the messenger.
One thing, if I can interject for just a minute, one thing in relation to, you know, when's it going to arrive at the municipal wells? The really larger issue is how much of the groundwater, the aquifer, is going to be contaminated by the ethylene dibromide that's down there before it ever reaches the aquifer, or before it reaches the municipal wells. That's your real problem. I mean, you're wiping out a water supply potentially that goes into trillions of gallons of water down there. And that, I'm not exaggerating, if you have a half teaspoon of that ethylene dibromide, it was in every gallon of who knows how many millions of gallons of aviation gas that were spilled. Every one of those little teaspoons will contaminate about 9 million gallons of water. So you're looking at a huge potential for contaminated water that's no longer available. That's your most productive portion of the aquifer that's being destroyed right now as we're sitting here speaking.
Bill, what's your email address?
I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, it would have been a lot easier before it hit the aquifer to have cleaned it up. I mean, if they had started cleaning it up in the early 1990s or whenever they acknowledged that it was a spill, it would have been much easier. But now, what, 80% of it is into the aquifer and dissolving into the water. So it's going to, and the longer it waits, the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to clean up. But as long as I have the floor, let me just give my perspective on this. I'm not a technical expert like Eric, and not even as much of a technical expert as Dave, but I got interested in this issue a couple years ago, partly because I'm a homeowner in the Southeast Heights. My house is not right by the base, but it's, I don't know, a mile and a half or so from there. My daughter, until a few months ago, was living right across from the VA in an apartment, and essentially right on top of the spill. So I began to see the stories in the Albuquerque Journal, and it got my attention. And then I began to go to these CAB meetings, these community meetings. And the more I've gone to those, the more concerned I've gotten. And I can tell you, I have no confidence in these official spokespeople who are in charge of this. The people from NMED and Kirtland, and there was a guy who came in from the CDC and talked about his report. They're just, it's pathetic. They seem to think that the answer to this is public relations. I think they've been told you need to go in and placate the public. And they take up, they don't allow much time for questions, they take up most of the time, they smile a lot, assure everyone that they're going to deal with this, but they don't really know what they're doing. I mean, it's appalling, really. And I got interested in citizen action because, you know, Dave and others were sometimes at these meetings. They seemed to be the only people that knew what they were talking about and seemed to take this seriously. I mean, the guy from the CDC, for instance, talked about his report at some length. never mentioned EDB. The most, I mean, Dave was there and said, you know, really, you know, he hadn't said anything about EDB, which is the most serious, most toxic
The
of all
most
the
amazing,
contaminants.
I think, the most amazing statement that after his presentation was when they said we're going to have to find an alternative water source.
An alternative water
Oh, that's right. Well, that's what I was going to, you know, end up with. Yeah, that's what really. Then what we'll do is we'll just shut these wells down. Don't worry. When the contamination hits the wells, we're going to shut them down. So, I mean, that's not a solution. I mean, then I really got concerned because, you know, we're in a serious drought, and I think we're going to be in a permanent state of drought. Frankly, I mean, I'm a believer in global warming and climate change, and I don't think this is a temporary drought. I think this is going to be the new normal, is drought for this region. And the one saving grace is that we have had, anyway, uncontaminated groundwater. So anyway, as I said when we met with Mariana, I've gotten so concerned about this that my husband and I now are considering relocating from this region, and I'm not the only one. And I heard actually yesterday that there are now some real estate agents who won't even take property in the Southeast Heights because they're afraid this is going to blow up on them. I mean, this is serious. It has to. I mean, if something begins to happen, if we can begin to see some forward motion on this, but you know, they've known about this. They've known about this for over 20 years, and basically almost nothing has happened. There's a little bit of this.
Do the real estate agents indicate that on that disclosure sheet when you're trying to sell your home that this now has to be part of that, or not?
Actually, I can answer that because I'm the one that told her this. No.
Okay.
They just aren't
Not
taking
required.
it. The ones I've talked to just aren't showing the homes. They won't take them to sell. And these are some of the best-known real estate agents for over 20 years in Southeast Albuquerque. You might even recognize their names, given the contacts you have with the community.
But you know, people tend to think that this is an issue for homeowners in the general vicinity, but actually it's going to affect all of Albuquerque. I mean, I since have discovered that my water actually does not come from the Ridgecrest wells, which are the ones that are the most immediately threatened. My water comes from Burton wells, which are not, you know, but if they start shutting down, the Ridgecrest wells are some of the most productive and most pure. They're better in terms of the arsenic levels and so on. If they start shutting down those wells, it's going to be a huge water crisis for all of Albuquerque. I don't think people understand that.
If I could ask a question in regards to the memorial.
Yes.
In all the discussions in the various committees, was there any discussion of the state, if they want to set up this task force as a result of this memorial, actually providing some funds for the task force? Was that broached at all?
The funding is to be it's to be obtained by the congressional delegation. The state didn't consider, itself obtaining the funding for this.
And did they discuss how it would come about with no earmarks and EPA and DOD already having put up funds for this, where that money might come from?
No, that wasn't a particular detail in the discussion.
I mean, in the end, from a regulatory point of view, it's really up to the Air Force to fund these. They're the ones that should really be paying for all of the above. They are paying for NMED. They should, and I think this is a case where we have a situation where we need extra support to make this go forward, to get it on track. And I think it would be extremely, in the big picture, good use of the Air Force's money, because it is not on track. The stakeholders are not happy. It's not going well technically. There's a spectrum of reasons. NMED is reaching out. I don't know that they're going to admit anything, but they're definitely beginning to reach out nationally. It's a path. It's not the only path, but it's a path that I think should happen. And the rightful responsible party who started it all and who is legally responsible is the Air Force, and they're to pay for every aspect of this cleanup. They're going to be paying for the VA well, which you probably know well, is already connected to city water. They're going to be having to pay for eternity for that city water, because they destroyed their well, or soon to, presumably. It hasn't been switched over yet, but it could be in a matter of minutes, switched over. They've already made that arrangement, and they are talking, I'm told, with the Air Force to make sure that that happens. The Water Authority has gotten the Air Force to pay, not all, probably should have, but of the CH2M Hill contingency plan. They are the responsible party. I mean, there's just no doubt about it.
I'm told the Air Force agreed to pay for half of that.
Right, but they should be paying for all of it. I mean, that's the way it is in the real world, is that when you're responsible for something, you know, and you can pay for it, which they can, it's their obligation to rectify this problem. I mean,
Let me
You said
kick
that-
in just a,
If I could, I was just curious, when you said that NMED has reached out to national experts,
yeah, that's,
how did that come about? And
Well, they asked-
Are they acceptable to, those people acceptable to you? Do you know them?
they reached out in the modeling to Kerr Lab, which is the national, that's when I say they've reached out, they've gone beyond Region 6
Right.
to Kerr Lab to get the modeling done. NMED initiated that. They're the ones that are asking for that model. The reason that paper was released in draft was to NMED. NMED is still asking that modeler, Ellinger, to expand that model. I think he's a good modeler, but there are holes in the data that shouldn't be there. He shouldn't have, well, that's a technical, but you can, the reason that there are criticisms and you get different answers in the model is because they didn't use a conceptual site model, they didn't plan it, and they asked for modeling when they should have known that they didn't have all the data to do a vetted model, let me put it that way. And all of the information and so on that goes out to the public should not be through the Albuquerque Journal. It should not be through the Air Force before it goes to NMED. You know, NMED is the one that in nationally, historically, legally, in every way, is the one that should be vetting, compiling, making sure the information that is needed is being gotten. And so you have to ask why. Well, it's been moved 3 times within NMED. They've had to they're reaching out now nationally. I think they need help. I think this memorial makes an infinite amount of sense. And personally, and from everything I know regulatorily, the Air Force should be paying for it. But it would be up to you folks to negotiate that situation. But why shouldn't they be? I mean, we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for their negligence. They basically were negligent in the operation of that bulk transfer facility. They did not check the pressure in the pipes. They did not check for leaks. When it first started, as she mentioned, they did not adequately test the groundwater. They made an assumption that it was only in the Vado zone. They put in the SVE systems and ran them for years without making adequate well investments and testing. In every step, the Air Force has been negligent, is the only way I can put it, in terms of their operations. And they fully admit full responsibility, and they fully admit in the CAB meetings or state that they will pay for this situation. Well, this situation needs to be put on track, and part of that, if you choose to go this way, should be paid for by the Air Force.
And my understanding is that they have, and I don't know the name of it, but they have sort of their own Superfund site, and that comes from an appropriation, which all of our bosses advocate for. And they've never not had money that they've requested. And we will
This is
continue.
not on the national priority list. Many sites within the Air Force are on the national priority list. That subject has been broached. That's something that, to be meaningful, has to be requested by NMED and processed through EPA and so on. Whether that would help or not, I talked to Washington about that. There's 2 levels. It can be put on the national priority list, and then you're up against other sites.
Slow things down considerably.
Pardon?
Wouldn't it slow things down considerably?
That's a matter of
Do
congestion.
you think
I don't know how things could be slowed down more than they slowed down.
Well,
And I think people like Ryan Flynn saying arguing that in public is a bunch of nonsense.
well,
it could slow it.
Speaking from a legal perspective, okay, if you look at RCRA, 42 U.S.C. 6973. There's provisions in there for an emergency response to this problem under RCRA. You can also do an emergency response under Superfund, okay? Now, we've asked the Environment Protection Agency, Region 6, to impose an emergency response to this. They sent us a letter back and said, no, thank you. NMED's in charge. NMED refuses to impose an emergency response. You were asking about funding, money, okay. NMED has full authority to issue an order, and if it's not followed, they can fine them $25,000 a day for every violation of that order, okay? Now, NMED won't do it because the political setup here under Governor Martinez is such that she doesn't want that kind of conflict between the State Environmental Department and the Air Force. Okay? She fired the last guy, moved him out, James Biarzi. You know, Biarzi said you're dealing with a major league problem in a little league fashion. And not too long after that comment, they gagged him. He couldn't talk to the press. And then he was moved out of the Hazardous Waste Bureau. And he was the one that made that order in 2010 for a plan right away to start cleaning this stuff up, short-term and long-term, and for the dissolved plume. That order has never been brought back for enforcement by the Environment Department. There's been 4 years of violations of that, okay? You know, they could have been fined, they could have been yanked into federal court like that. And I think a federal court would have gone along with telling the Air Force what they're going to have to do. But that's not the process, okay? I've tried everything I know administratively, okay, to get this thing moving. I've filed a request with EPA in DC, went down to Region 6 in Dallas, asking for an emergency response on this, either under RCRA or under Superfund, okay? They said, no, we don't want to do that, you know. Then we subsequently sent an application some months ago asking for it to be put on Superfund, National Priorities List, okay? What happened to that application? Region 6 sent it over to the Air Force to be reviewed under an executive order. I don't recall the number of it. So that is ostensibly being looked at for review by the Air Force, okay? Now everybody says, well, it's going to slow things down if it goes on Superfund. Well, maybe, but at this point in time, you know, we also drafted these memorials to the legislature. And they looked at it and they said, hey, this is a problem, you know. Now, I don't care what process moves this thing forward, but there needs to be something to move it forward. And I would prefer that the congressional delegation get it in gear and give some help to this process because it is stuck. It's stuck. And if the congressional delegation can get it rolling, get a task force and some really knowledgeable people that say, look, here's what NMED can do. We want to see cooperation with the Air Force on this, you know. That'd be preferable to me, you know. That'd be preferable to me. That'd be fine, you know. If it doesn't go in, I mean, let's face it, the Air Force has got 42 Superfund sites, and they're all in a shambles, and they've contaminated water all over the country, and so is the rest of the DOD complex. So,
But this is their number one.
this,
This
Well,
is ranked number one
it's
nationally
the,
by
it's
the
the
Air Force
biggest.
themselves.
It's the
Because
biggest.
it's got a very, there's a number of reasons that we're not going to go through those, but it's number one. So if you did a ranking by the Air Force of their number ones, of their size, this comes number one.
Okay. I want to say a couple things generally. I've met with Mariana, and we've had a couple emails, so that's kind of a new relationship. And I've talked with you many times going back 18 months or so. I've seen you at CAB meetings. We had one brief conversation. I said, let's talk. It's the first time these things have come together, and it came together as a function of trying to make the request of the memorial real. And it presumes several things. It presumes that that water supply has to, no matter what, remain safe for Albuquerque. That this is a serious problem and that it's not being addressed. And we get so much back information since I've been doing this from the Air Force and elsewhere that it is being addressed. It's maddening, and for someone like me who's never done this kind of thing before. I've been an engineer, had a custom software shop and some other things. People that look you in the eye and believe what they're saying, that everything's just fine. And I've looked at this, it's not just fine. So with that said, the idea of this was to try and, I hate to say to try, we want to move forward this memorial. So 3 distinct positions you all have. I'd just like to say one thing, Bill, that you brought up several times about the state funding things with this. When I spoke with you and Eric, me and Eric spoke with you just before Christmas, 2.5 hours. And one of the things you mentioned then was, well, couldn't the state pony up to do a few things?
I'm sorry, couldn't what?
Couldn't the state find some dollars, do some budgeting, what have you? 2 things I'll say about that. One, it's 100% federal responsibility to clean this up. So, period. That should not be something that's even asked by your boss. Given that he sits on appropriations, and I've said this before, and I want to be respectful and polite with her. I don't think he knows the seriousness of this. And he should be demanding it. So there's a different rule for Senator Udall. I honestly don't know what Senator Hyland has done on that. You know, I know I've seen you at the meetings, and I really appreciate that, because we haven't gotten too many of the people who should be there to be there. They haven't heard stuff in the room. I'd really like to hear you guys comment on what your take is, what you hear in those rooms, because I think it's, no other way to say it, it's nonsense. The last one was almost sad, it was so bad. So, separate roles. All your bosses need to know that this isn't getting done. And if the military and the EPA people are telling them it is, then they aren't telling them the truth. For whatever reason. You know, we've got all this budgeting. It's a tradition here to fund the labs. Going back long before Udall was in it. It's jobs, jobs. It's a perpetuation of the culture in this community. But a lot's changed. You know, a lot's changed. And there's a lot of expertise in those labs that can be working on solutions we need for this now. And all we're hearing is more funding for ramping up the restoration of these old nuclear weapons, which means more uranium mining. And it's like this whole cycle of what got us here seems to be re-perpetuating itself and obscuring a community-wide conversation with politicos, local, state, and federal, to be in agreement about what's even going on with this jet fuel spill. So, just a couple other things real quick. Your statement generally about, it's my understanding there's some kind of Superfund thing, or however you put it, by which money is delivered to this project. We go back to all the documents. There's lots of references to this fund and that fund within military protocols that they've gotten some funding for along the way. Since I've been in, and since 2010, there was a budgeting for approximately $50 million, approximately 3 years ago. We're pretty sure most of that was spent, and this is people who won't say it publicly, but have told us within the Air Force, this was so, it was spent about a year ago. And yet, whichever of you were at the last CAB meeting, Colonel Lanning and Tom Blaine both stood up there and said, we have $50 million. So I think you guys should be able to tell us how much they have. If you don't know that, that's something that needs to be known. How much money have they gotten? Where's it come from? What's the Air Force requesting? For how long? Something we've been asked for a long time, and it's a black hole. Mark Sanchez, the director at the Water Authority, has said point blank in front of them when asked by Mary Stebbins and a couple others, how much money is allocated for this? He says, nobody knows.
Well, somebody knows.
Well, he doesn't know.
Somebody knows.
And he's the director of the Water Authority here, whose responsibility it is to provide delivery of safe water in perpetuity for Albuquerque. And who we're told has received this enhanced working relationship with the Air Force. You know, so I say this with all due respect, Bill. This money needs to be coming federally. And the percentage of money that's going to this whole new round of weapons stuff, nuclear stuff, 5% of that, 5% of that could get this project rolling tomorrow.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, seriously. That is all it would take. Yet we keep having these meetings and keep having these meetings, and we leave them wondering what people are really thinking. You know, it hasn't changed much. And I think it's going to take really heroic people that are willing to stand up because they know that this is serious and out of control, this bill, that nothing's getting done, that people are going to get sick, and that an expression of priorities through dollars allocated needs to happen. It's that big of a problem. You know?
Well, I think the absence of funding, the failure to put in the technology, the failure to do the adequate studies, all lead to one conclusion, and that is that the Air Force intends, apparently, to allow this plume of contamination to hit the municipal wells, thinking that it'll probably be cheaper to shut down the wells, find another source, find another place for the wells. I mean, that was the plan that they laid out to Congress in 2011. So, you know, we're just asking the delegation to cut through this stuff, you know. I mean, if it looks like...
Can you send me that? Because I hadn't heard that, about their plan to let it hit the wells.
Yeah, it was a report to the, what's the Armed Services Defense Committee, something like that. I forget the exact.
Yeah, if you could give me
Yeah, I'd be happy to forward that to you. But I mean, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, you know, one can only conclude that that duck is going to allow this plume of contamination to hit the wells. There can't be any other conclusion. And the only thing that these models do is take our eye off the ball, pacify the public, and set us up for a real disaster. I mean, you look at all of these disasters that have happened in just recent history. And it's a result of people not taking the action when they could have taken the action to start cleaning it up. Now, the time frame for this of 30, 40 years, you can throw that in the trash can. It's nonsense. It's just nonsense. one, they don't know when it's gonna arrive. Two, they don't know, there's a tremendous amount of water being contaminated. Now, Robert Gilkison, who's a hydrogeologist, and he spoke with Mariana last time, he's spoken with you, I believe. He looked at some of this, and using just some calculations off the data he saw, he concluded it looks like a 5 to 7 year time frame as far as he's concerned. Now, the Environment Department said they saw a 5 to 7 year time frame using the EPA model. Now, what hasn't been provided to us, and I guess I got to do a FOIA again, or a records request, is how many different runs did they do before they chose this particular draft report to issue to the public. I'm not naive on this. I've seen this happen before. I saw it with the mixed waste landfill. They did 21 different drafts before the lawyers finally massaged it to the point where it looked like there wasn't really a problem, but there was a problem, and that was in the document. So I've seen this kind of massaging of the data and the facts and everything going on. And if you really, I don't know if you've read that report cover to cover from EPA, the uncertainties in there are so great that they can't make those conclusions. They just cannot draw those conclusions. And, you know, Interra criticized that.
And Dave and I, did you all see this article? Dave and I wrote this critique of that EPA report.
That article was based largely on conversations with Robert Gilkison, but I mean also in just looking at the report and what the report says about the uncertainty. Start on page 63, and it says, you know, hydraulic conductivity. They don't have it. Well, that's one of the most basic things in characterizing a plume. If you can't characterize under RCRA, you can't do remediation. Now, what they're going to be coming out with real soon is the Air Force is going to tell us that they've characterized this thing, and that they're ready to start talking about the final solutions for it. That's what's going to be coming out of this RCRA process, and it's phony as a $3 bill.
So, explain why.
Well, they're going to have a corrective measures study, okay?
Corrective measures investigation.
Yeah, corrective measures, the data from the monitoring wells they put in. They're not putting any more monitoring wells in. The NMED wanted 33 more monitoring wells put in. The Air Force said, nah, we'll only give you 9. And that's in 3 locations, okay?
And they said specifically, the reason was they didn't have in their budget the money to do what was requested.
So, given the lack of data, they simply haven't characterized this plume. They can't have characterized it because they simply don't have the monitoring between the last known point of this plume and where the municipal wells are.
So, just so I understand, the RCRA process requires a characterization.
Yes, it does. That's the first
Yes.
thing.
And so the Air Force is doing the characterization, but the problem that you guys, the contention is that the characterization is bogus.
It's
So
inadequate.
It's inadequate.
It's inadequate.
Right.
Well, and the
Okay.
reason that it's inadequate was what I brought up earlier, is the mechanism by which you make sure there's a plan, and a vetted plan, and agreed upon plan, so that you don't have holes in the future in the data and the characterization, and you don't have an iterative process, is that you do what's called a conceptual site model, which is really basically a detailed plan, if you will, that integrates all of the information that is needed. And then as the data is collected, there may need to be more data because the conceptual site model needs to expand based on information that was found. In this case, the plume was infinitely bigger. There was separation of the EDB than they thought. But
So
by
there was a step that was skipped to get to the characterization.
well,
in the RCRA
they should have
process.
gone in parallel. In
Okay.
other words, there was a plan, but it wasn't cast in terms of a conceptual site model. And that's where the guidelines that I'm telling you for RECRA clearly point out that you need to be building a conceptual site model. It's basically an integrated collection of the information that would be required, and as you require it, you enhance the picture, basically, of the complete site, of what's there, what's happening, the amount of mass at each location, the mass flux, how fast it's moving. I mean, there's a lot of the geology, the hydrology, et cetera. And there are documents, there's 50-page documents for New Jersey just to how do you create a conceptual site model. I have passed that along to NMED, I've passed it along to the Air Force.
Is that the Atlantic City site? Is that the Atlantic City site?
No, it's a general document for New Jersey EPA. That's one of many that have written their own guidance document as to what needs to be done in the interpretation of this law. This law is the most, I hate to say it's at the top of the food chain. It doesn't get into the details of how you do it. It's well understood, and EPA has come out with guidance documents on how you interpret, deploy, implement the RECRA process. They have not followed that. And that's why I have a deep concern that, and it's a complete answer to me as to why you have missing data for the modeler. You now ask the modeler to do it, there's not the data there. My concern is throwing money at a situation where we have a management problem, from my perspective, is not going to solve it. So if you throw money at a management structure that was flawed in the past, why are you not going to have a flawed go-forward management structure? I want to correct that and see that any money, and minimize the money that's spent, because you now have spent a lot of money and you don't have the data and you don't have it characterized.
With the 33 wells or the 9 wells approach, what you need in terms of the data?
Would have helped a lot.
It would have helped. Let me go into a little more depth.
And
on
the answer
this
to
one.
that, real quickly, Bill, is that's only one little corner.
Right, yeah.
There are many gaps that because they haven't followed the conceptual site model that are missing. Just one example, they have no idea of what the flow rate and nature of material coming from the Vados zone is into the groundwater itself. They don't have any justification, and I've asked for it in those CAB meetings many times. Give me that information so I know that your money spent on the SVEs, which they're proud of, not working, but proud of, is doing something meaningful to the total problem. They don't have that. They don't have that kind of fundamental information that is incorporated in, again, I have to use this conceptual site model because it's just generic. There's no environmental regulator in the world, in the country, that wouldn't know exactly what that means except the one that we have in charge of our project.
So Dr. Nuttall, would you say that they should go out and install additional monitoring wells and go through that process or extend that process?
I'm suggesting that they need to use the best technical guidance from an oversight task force, whatever, to plug all of the holes and to get a go-forward plan that they're calling for in this memorial. If you do it piecemeal, and you're asking these piecemeal questions, that's exactly the problem, is it's been done piecemeal. It's been done piecemeal by this agency, putting in this input, by this, by that, by this person, that person's interpretation of what's needed. That isn't what we need. We need a vetted technical oversight board that really has the horsepower to get them a plan, a go-forward plan to ask which data are missing, how do we go forward with this problem, do we need more wells, is that the best use of our money, what's the timing for this, how do we proceed forward, how do we make sure that we're going to get to the goal of protecting the water source, our pumping wells, if that's our goal. We don't even have objectives. There aren't even objectives out there as to what they're doing. So they're so far from, when you ask these specific questions, you know, would that solve the problem? The answer is no.
What you're saying then is to take a step
It
back.
will not solve the
And
problem.
evaluate
Take a
everything.
step
There
back.
needs to be a.
They need to
Really
step
take a
back.
look
There
at
needs
the
to be
big
a
picture.
top-to-bottom review of what they've done, and it needs to be fixed, and it needs to be put into a plan that's vetted by real experts that will get us on track and give us the best timing, the best expenditure of our money. Throwing money at a bad system, I have teenagers, I know all about throwing money at bad, will not solve the problem. So you cannot piecemeal this. And that's what's happening without this comprehensive plan that's called for here, or a conceptual site model is in the environmental world.
So regardless of what the characterization says,
It's not complete.
it's just,
It's not.
even if it shows,
Let me address one other thing.
It's not adequate at this time.
With respect to just the groundwater monitoring, okay? There's what I call the battle of the bubbles, okay? And this has been going on for 2 years. The Environment Department has pointed out that the monitoring wells, and I finally got a list under FOIA of how many monitoring wells are affected, and it's like dozens and dozens and dozens. They have air bubbles in the samples, okay, that they're taking. Well, the air bubbles destroy the volatile organic compounds that you see, that you would otherwise see in a sample. So these samples are not reliable and representative of what's going on in the groundwater, okay? That's just one little aspect. Another aspect is these wells are, they'll have, in a nest, they call them, they'll have 3 wells, shallow, intermediate, deep, okay? A lot of the shallow wells have been covered up because of the rising groundwater due to conservation measures. So those aren't accurate, you know? Yet they're taking this data.
And they take 1,000 samples a month. And you have all of these holes because it has not been vetted. They do not have a plan. They have not been integrating a plan into this. You have modelers having to create their own plan, their own conceptual site model, which is going to be, each one's going to come up with a different model with different conditions, et cetera, because there isn't one vetted, comprehensive picture of this site, and they haven't been working towards that, which is what's required in the guidance documents for implementation of RCRA. And it's only common sense. And so when you don't do that, now you have all of this noise, as I call it, issues, whatever term you folks use, and it will only get worse. Because you now will think you've characterized it, you will try to go forward and do remediation based on not having it characterized, and you can't do that.
I guess my question is it incompetence that you're claiming, or is it conspiracy? Is it that you think that the Air Force just wants it to hit the wells like they said in 2011, or is it incompetence up and down the line? What is the?
I think
because I'm hearing 2 different.
I think it's
intentions.
incompetence, and that's why
I'm not
I
going for conspiracy. The incompetence is just incredible. I mean, even though a layperson like myself, I go and I read these reports. If you go and you read the older environmental department reports, and then you come up through them. I mean, I've done a lot of look at the history of this, and I've written about it. And you come up to the more recent reports, it's the same issues over and over again, you know. Not enough monitoring, bad monitoring, you know, effective monitoring, not enough equipment in place. I mean, it's the same thing. But like Eric says, it's all coming from a place of where they haven't laid out a comprehensive way of how they're going to go about examining this problem and solving it. I mean, the problem is immense. We're going to lose that VA well, you know, and that's 72 million gallons a year that the city's going to have to make up soon, by the way. And then the next thing that's on board is you're going to lose Kirtland Air Force Base number 3. They shut down number 16. They haven't turned it on yet. Too high in arsenic, they say. That's internal documents. 15 was shut down, but they're not sampling 16 anymore. So I mean, you know, how far are we going to let this thing go? If they shut those Kirtland or the Ridgecrest municipal wells down, that's not the end of this story. It's going to keep moving right on through those well fields to the north. There's 42 wells to the north of the Ridgecrest wells. So we're not done by any means. If you shut those down and don't have treatment, the problem just continues. It's gonna go through, I mean, Dwight Patterson has talked about this extensively, I think, you know. And
Let me ask you a couple specifics about the task force,
Yeah.
if I could. The participants you identified here are primarily federal employees. These are federal dollars already going to these agencies, right?
That we
You've got-
identified?
You've got ATSDR, you've got the Air Force, you've got EPA, USGS. So
Which part are you looking at from
I'm
the?
looking at number four
Number
on the
4.
second side.
Page 2.
oh, that's just, no, that's not to have those people on there. That's, it's for review
All
of
right,
those
so
records from
the
those.
larger question is, and this may be an unfair question,
Infinitely small amount of money to do planning versus making mistakes, not getting the job done, having, if it indeed impacts the economy of Albuquerque, housing, et cetera. So, I mean, I think it's a very rational expenditure of a very small amount of money to try. You know, you hope everything's successful. Not everything is, but you're gonna try to put this onto the best possible track possible for managerial, technically, and using the best cost benefit to our monies, get the environment cleaned up and so on. And I think we have a problem or we wouldn't be here, and the issue is how do we solve it? Others have obviously looked at this memorial, others have agreed with the concept of it. How it gets deployed and implemented really is something that has flexibility. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can do that. How it evolves and so on. But competency, I think, is really important, managerial and technical. And I want to see people that have done these big problems before helping us in New Mexico do this problem, both managerially and technically, so we don't have these holes.
Yes, Jim. It's kind of a leap of faith question. Can this be solved? Dwight Patterson
Absolutely.
talks about ways of doing it. You know, so there are eventually, once all the data and everything is brought together, there is a conceivable way to solve this problem.
Well, there's a conceivable technical way to go forward with this problem. And we've done thousands of sites. It is a big problem.